Hello, this is Peter Svidler for chess24, and I'm continuing with my series on 6d3 in the Spanish. And in this video, we will continue the discussion of the position you see on the board, which arises after b5, bishop b3, d6, a3, castles, knight c3. And in this video, I will talk about knight a5, bishop a2, and the options available to black here. Mainly black has to choose here between c5 and bishop e6. Bishop e6 is the more fashionable one. There has just been a high-level game played starting from that position in the St. Louis tournament, which Fabiano Caruana won against Levon Aronian, and this game will feature prominently in the second part of the video, but let's start with c5. After c5, white has an option of playing knight d5 straight away. There's also bishop g5, but I think the best move in this position is b4. Let's briefly discuss the other options. After bishop g5, black plays bishop e6. If white plays b4 here, knight c6, knight d5. This has been seen in a game between Linier Dominguez and Levon Aronian in Vike in 2014, and takes, knight d4, bc5, knight f3, queen f3, dc5, rook e1, knight d7, and the position is very, very unclear, but Linier misplayed it and lost after bishop d2, bishop d6. He spent two moves trying to activate the bishop on a2. As I mentioned in the previous video, the main problem for white in these types of structures, which appear quite regularly in this line, is that it's not quite clear what to do with this bishop on a2. I'm as big a fan of the bishop majority as there is maybe in top level chess. I would always take two bishops over a bishop and a knight in most cases. Well, always in most cases are sort of mutually exclusive, but you know what I mean. But here, the bishop on a2 makes me feel quite uncomfortable. I'm not quite sure how to improve its prospects. And in the game, Linier went a4, f5, bishop b3, and Levon immediately seized his opportunity to shut out this bishop entirely, and black is already at least fighting for advantage, and Levon eventually won a very, very nice game. And after bishop takes f6, knight d5, knight c6, I discussed a position like this, or maybe even this particular position via a different move order in the previous video. I think black is perfectly fine here, because yes, the knight on d5 is a very beautiful looking piece, but it's very difficult for white to actually achieve anything, whereas black has easy prospects on the king side, some plans connected with g6, bishop g7, on perhaps bishop g5, bishop h6 is also a possibility, and then king h8 and f7, f5 comes into play. So this is not very ambitious. As for 11, knight d5, I think the best move for black here is not knight c6, which allows white to transpose back to b4, but the immediate knight takes d5, which was played by, among others, Mickey Adams against Vish Anand in a Baden-Baden tournament. Takes and bishop b7, and after b4, knight, bishop d5, e d5, knight b7. It turned out that black is doing okay even when the bishop is not stuck on a2 and it has already been exchanged, because black has a very simple plan of preparing an f7 square for this knight. He goes something like queen c7, rook e1, f5, and if black manages to get knight d8 and knight f7 in, you could argue that his position is maybe even the more harmonious of the two. The game continued bishop g5, rook a8, a4, takes, bishop g5, knight g5, knight d8, and black held in the following play. But b4, I believe, poses certain problems for black here. After knight c6, knight d5, black has a number of options. There were two games, top grandmaster games, one between Hansen and Nibak, in which Tommy played bishop g4 here, h3, bishop h5, but the position after c3 takes, a5, g4, and bishop g6 should be quite a bit better for white. White retains some pressure in the game after bishop d2 takes knight d5, bishop d5, queen d7. But I think even stronger is to take on a5 here, rook a5, and play bishop e3. And the bishop on g6 is horrible, and the pawn on b5 is still weak. And even if black manages to exchange it for the c3 pawn, he is not entirely equal because the bishop on g6 is so completely out of play. But it's not immediately obvious how black will achieve this here. So this doesn't equalize. Also, knight takes d5 is not a particularly attractive option because after bishop d5, queen c7, white can simply take on c5, dc5, and play bishop b2, and he exerts a certain pressure against the e5 pawn, and this is not particularly pleasant for black. And there was also a very, very exciting game starting from this position played between Alexander Motylev and Evgeny Nair, in which Evgeny played knight d4, and Alexander picked up the challenge, so to speak, and played b takes c5, to which black replied by knight d5, bishop d5, and suddenly bishop g4, bishop a8, queen a8. And since there are better options available to white, I did not really analyze this position in any kind of depth. But amazingly, even the machine agrees this is at the very least quite decent and could be maybe even entirely correct, even though black has no immediate threats and still needs some time to bring his pieces over and start a proper frontal attack. But the pin is so unpleasant that black has fantastic compensation for the exchange here. However, instead of this, white could take knight takes d4, and here I think he still has some pressure. C takes d4, f4, knight takes g5. Other options are not particularly attractive for black either, because white is, among other things, threatening to take on e5. For instance, after bishop e6, white can take on e5, d5, knight e7, queen e7, and bishop g5, ruining black's structure on the king side. So this is inadvisable. Therefore, knight d5, bishop d5, rook b8. And in this position, unfortunately, after both takes, queen h5, bishop f6, and queen h5 takes on f4, bishop f4, and bishop e6, in both these cases, black holds reasonably comfortably due to the fact that his structural weaknesses are neatly compensated by a weak pawn on c2, against which black will always have counterplay along the c-file. However, there is a much more aggressive option available to white here. He can play f5, bishop b7. Of course, we should not be trading this bishop, bishop b3. Unfortunately, it does not quite work. I tried giving immediate mate by playing queen g4 and rook f3, but after bishop d5, rook h3, black has bishop takes e4, de4, and g6. These moves are strictly only moves, but unfortunately, after this series of only moves, bishop h4 is the only move that doesn't lose on the spot. Queen h5, queen f6, rook f3, queen e7, and here black is at least fine. So white shouldn't be playing like this, but he can play bishop b3, d5, and queen g4, and the machine is originally quite happy for black here, but I think this position is quite dangerous. For instance, queen d6, rook f3, d4, d4, rook bc8, bishop d2, protecting against rook c8, c3. We don't want to allow any defensive trades for now. And in this position, rook f1, rook h3 comes quite fast, and black has to be very, very careful here, or he could get mated. So c5 b4, I believe, allows white to hope for advantage. Therefore, the main move right now is bishop e6, which is what a lot of top players played, including Levon on a number of occasions, and also Rustam Kasimzhanov in his game against Veselin Topalov in a Thessaloniki Grand Prix. Bishop e6, fe, b4. Of course, white should not be allowing c5. As I mentioned earlier, this structure with the double d pawns is there are two completely different structures depending on whether the c-pawn is on c5 or c7. With the pawn on c5, black would be very, very comfortable here. With the pawn on c7, less so. Bishop d2, and in this position, the current fashion is to play d5. I will mention the move knight d4, which is Kasimdzhanov played against Topalov, because I believe this is actually perhaps definitely a more interesting choice. It's a choice which leads to less static and more double-edged play, I believe. Knight d4, e4, knight e2, c5. And in this position, Topalov played h3, which is a generally useful move. And also, as you will see in later lines, in a lot of positions, black plays d5, e5, knight g4, which this move effectively stops. But unfortunately, after queen d7, queen b1, which is the normal way for white to proceed on the queen side here, he wants to play queen b1 and then a4 in some fashion, creating some threats against the black structure on the queen side. Black has an option of playing a6, a5 here. And the idea for this is that if b takes a5, black can play bishop d8, of course, and after queen b2, black can effectively shut down the entire queen side by playing a4 here, which I think is to his advantage, because he no longer has to worry about protecting his queen side here, and he can perhaps even start thinking about playing e5 and c4 later on. So I think it's more critical to start with a4 straight away. And in this position, white has definite pressure, and black needs to be very, very precise if he doesn't want to find himself in trouble. Queen d7, queen b1. And in this position, if black plays passively, I don't think he will equalize. White wants to play something like queen b3, or in many cases, queen a2 is also a very smart move, because it creates a threat of a b5, and black will not be able to recapture with a pawn, because the rook on a8 will be hanging, and therefore black will have to relinquish control of the a file. And in this position, black more or less has to break through in the center by playing d5. And in the complications after e5, knight g4, a takes b5, which I think is the best move in this position. A takes, rook a8, bishop f4. Black seems to be holding on after g5, which once again I think is the best move here, because after queen c7, white can play h3, forcing black to take on e5, and after bc5, bishop c5, rook e1, black's numerous weaknesses begin to show, and white has a very comfortable advantage here. But after g5, and for instance f3, knight e3, takes, bc5, bishop c5, f4, and bishop e7, white still has a slight advantage here, but I think objectively this position should be holdable for black. But still, you know, black has to be very, very precise, and you can also fish around somewhere around a4, queen d7 for possible improvements to white's play. I don't think this position is entirely dead, although, as I said, I suspect with correct play, black should be holding this. But the current fashion after bishop d2 is not to play knight d4, but to play d5. And, well, I'm saying current fashion, but it's only been 2 games. But when those 2 games are played with black by Aronian and Karyakin, you kind of sit up and take notice. And here I will be very heavily basing the following on the game between Caruana and Aronian, and my notes for that game that I wrote sort of immediately after the game for chess24. I don't claim this analysis is exhaustive, but I think the idea shown by Fabiano is very, very interesting, and black's life is not particularly easy there. Rook e1, queen d6, and here Fabiano played one of the more remarkable, I think, theoretical novelties I've seen in the past year, even though, you know, some of them involve huge sacrifices, and this might not strike you as, you know, such a great deal, but to come up with a move as weird as this I really respect Fabiano and his team for coming up with this idea. He went knight a2 here, as you probably know. In the stem game, after h3, knight d7, knight e2, which is what white normally does in this structure, he tries to get the knight over to g3. As a general remark, white's position is very nice here, but the knight on c3 does very little, and you want to transfer it to some more useful square. And generally speaking, in the Spanish, you get the queenside knight, you aim towards g3 as a kind of a general rule of thumb. And this is what white did in the stem game, h3, knight d7, knight e2. But after a5, rook b1 takes, rook fb8, knight g3, and d5, d4, the pawn on b4 is quite weak, and black gets a lot of counterplay against this pawn. And c3 takes, rook a4, queen b3, king h8. We're still following the game between Dominguez and Karyakin from Beijing 2013, and black even won that game. I'm not saying black is already better, but he definitely has a lot of counterplay on the queen side because the b4 pawn is so weak. Whereas after Fabiano's idea, it's much harder to do all this. And also, the knight it takes the knight 3 moves, but if and when it gets to b3, it will stabilize the queen side so thoroughly that white's position improves greatly by this. And the big question, of course, here is whether white has the 3 tempi required for this. In the game, Levon decided he didn't need to take any drastic action, and he went knight d7. I believe at least very serious consideration has to be given to the move a6, a5 immediately, because I don't think black should be so indifferent to the prospect of the knight landing on b3. However, in this position after queen e2, I also analyzed other moves for white, but I don't think they are particularly convincing. But after queen e2, I couldn't find any immediate equality for black. Now, of course, the e5 pawn is hanging in a lot of lines. And let's say if black plays d4 here, white has the option of going b takes a5, knight takes a5, rook e b1. And it's actually not that easy to protect this pawn, because if rook fb8, a4, based on a tactical detail that if black takes on a4, if the knight on a5 gets lost, it's just very unpleasant for black. And if black plays c4, then a4, b4, queen e1 is once again extremely strong, because black is very discoordinated and will probably lose the a4 pawn soon, and will end up with a really horrible structure. Therefore, black has to play knight d7 after rook b1, but after rook b5, queen a3, and for instance queen d1, it's quite obvious that white is at the very least slightly better, because he will have a lot of play on the light squares, and black is once again left with a really unappealing structure and a prospect of defending it for the rest of the game. But after a takes b4 instead of d4, white can take with a knight. And in this position, black once again finds it very hard to keep the material balance, because after knight d7, white has a tactical possibility of taking, and playing d4, which wins a pawn. e4, queen b5, takes, c5, d takes c5, knight takes c5, and knight d4. And although after rook a c8, black gets definite compensation for this pawn, it still is a more or less healthy pawn, and I don't think white should be particularly unhappy if he gets this position. So a5 does not seem to equalize on the spot, and after knight d7, Fabiano played queen e2, postponing any kind of decisive action for now. And after d4, he made another stunning move, I think. It's quite logical when you think about it, but on the other hand, it's not always that you play in this fashion when you switch so entirely to overprotecting the queen side before doing anything active on your own. It's very important to stop a5. Knight c1 would have been a big mistake allowing a5, but after rook e b1, it's much harder for for black to create any kind of counterplay on the queen side. I still think it was probably better to play rook fb8, knight c1, a5, takes, a4 and b4. At least here white has his own problems because the pawns on c2 and a4 will require constant attention. But I think white still has some pull here, and black would have to defend this position quite carefully. But in the game, after knight b6, knight c1, knight a4, and knight b3, black's position is, I think, potentially very, very dangerous. Levon said in his post-game interviews that he felt he came out quite well out of the opening, but I'm not quite sure if he realized just how dangerous this position potentially is, because after rook f7, the move he made, rook c1, rook d8, and knight g5, rook f6, queen h5, h6, and knight f3, black is basically stuck with this structure with a pawn on e5 that is weak and the knight on a4, which more or less can never leave, because if white manages to open a second front along the a file, it will be really, really bad for black. And Fabiano won a very, very nice and very convincing game. I think black still could get a playable position by playing knight c3 here. Takes, rook d1, and knight d4. But once again, the resulting position after takes, and not only e5, which is something I discussed in my notes to the game, but also something like g3, perhaps intending f4, and if e5, queen g4 for now, controlling the very important e6 square, because I don't think white should allow black to occupy the e6 square with the queen so easily. White has all kinds of plans. He can play for, let's say, rook f1 and f4 if he feels he's ready enough for that. And if black completely vacates the queen side, a3, a4 can also follow at a certain point, even if it's connected with a pawn sacrifice, because opening up the a file for the rook in many cases will be hugely beneficial for white. So I'm not entirely sure this position is equal, but I would still probably prefer it to the one Levon got in the game. But the general conclusion about this line, I think, should be that white retains some kind of pressure almost against any black's choice. As things stand right now, as a white player, I would perhaps be most worried about the somewhat forcing variations arriving after knight d4 takes, knight e2, and c5. At the moment of recording this video, I was not able to find any definitive advantage for white in this position, but it's very, very close, and I will continue trying, and I don't really have a feeling that this is completely dead for white. Perhaps I just wasn't careful enough in my analysis, and the lines starting with both h3 and especially a4 are very, very dangerous for black if he is if he is not precise. So by the standards of this line, I think this is quite promising for white, even if it's officially even if it's actually a draw in final analysis. I think white has a lot of chances to get an edge here if black makes even a slight mistake, which is not something you can always say in this line. This, I think, should conclude this particular video, and in the following videos there is still a small matter of bishop e6 in this position without knight a5, and also bishop g4, which is a very, very serious move which has been quite popular lately. Please stay tuned for those. This has been Peter Svidler for chess24.